Hello, everybody. Hello, hello. How's everyone doing? I hope everyone can hear me clearly. Joining me for another live stream. Thank you very much. Those of you who have been faithful to the marathon, we've been quite consistent with these live streams, haven't we? So fantastic. I got some ones. So I'm guessing that everybody can hear me okay. Surfactant, you're saying that you need to dip out for food. This shouldn't be too long. We'll be doing like 1 hour. I don't think we'll go over time like we did yesterday, go to 1 hour, 40 minutes. I think we'll just keep it an hour today. I think once we hit that hour mark, we can just always do another one or just, peg on another episode. There's no harm in that. But today's live stream, what is the topic that we'll be touching? I think many of you will have a clue. I probably put it in the description of the video already, but many of you will have a clue from the thumbnail on the left. So, quick question, actually, to the audience: does anyone know who this handsome young fella in the thumbnail is? And it's not a reconstruction of Ramesses, by the way. I'm interested to know. It's censored here. Maybe this is what censored looks like. So fact that you're quick off the mark. Very quick. It is W.E.B. Dubois or Dubois. A lot of people call him Dubois, which I think is weird. I think, isn't it French? Isn't it Dubois? I could be wrong. We have a boxer in the UK called Daniel Dubois, but that's how I always pronounced his name. I always pronounced it W.B. Dubois, but I've heard many people call him W.B. Dubois. So not sure which one is which. I was just asking Censored, is that what you look like? I'm really interested to know what you look like, because I know that you look like Ramesses, but I don't think we've Surfactants wrote, I think it's Dubois or Dubois. I may be wrong. You have to kind of that doesn't help, Censored. Oh, hilarious. So sorry, I was just getting a call, trying to sell a vehicle at the moment, and I felt like I should have answered that call, but it was bad timing. Let's get started today. So what are we doing? All right, so let me give you a bit of a background story so you understand where this is coming from and what we're going to be doing today. So this is W.E.B. Dubois, or Dubois, however you pronounce it. And W.E.B. Dubois is a scholar. I'm not sure what to call him, if we should call him a chronicler or a, I'm going to need to answer this call. I'm really sorry, guys. I know this is very unprofessional of me, but it's quite an important call. So I'm going to hit mute, and you guys are going to get a minute of silence. Sorry. I'm really sorry, guys. I'm really, really sorry about that. I think 10 of you dropped off, and rightly so. I had to answer the call. It was one of those. Yeah, I've been trying to sell this car for a little while, and yeah, it would have been foolish of me not to answer that call. So sorry about that. I'm back. So W.E.B. Dubois. Thank you, by the way, Surfactant, for your support. And the $5 donation says support the king. Yes, absolutely. On the note of supporting the king, I will be like Zahir Wasna and say, buy my book. My book. It's in the book. The book needs supporters, and we do need backing. It has been relatively stagnant for the past 3 days in terms of backers. So yeah, I'm obviously still very positive that we're gonna hit our target and beyond. But yeah, if you're kind of like and ahhing or on the fence, hopefully, yeah, you'll make your mind to make that investment. I've posted new articles on the website, and I'm going to be posting another one. I mentioned it yesterday. It's kind of, I finished writing it. I'm just doing the diagrams now, that are going to be part of that. That'll be posted in the next, I think in the next 24 hours, I should be able to post that other article. So I'll do some more articles. And I think some of the content from these articles are going to end up in the book as well. So there you go. But anyway, like I was just saying, W.E.B. Dubois is a American author. I think his speciality was in sociology, but he was very much immersed in kind of chronicling and challenging and writing books around the Black experience. He was involved in Pan-Africanism. And here's the interesting thing, okay? I was watching an interview with Vanessa Davies, who's an Egyptologist. Just came up kind of randomly, or maybe I was searching for her. I can't remember which one. It was one or the other. But I was watching one of her interviews. It was a very, very kind of underviewed interview. Probably had like about 300 views or something. And it was like 3 or 4 years old. So it was a relatively old interview. Very, very, very small number of views. But she has done some really exciting work. Now, to be clear as well, I did a video very, very early on in my YouTube journey where I critiqued one of Vanessa Davies' videos. And I didn't say anything derogatory or anything, but I did kind of come for her a bit. And I think in retrospect now, I'm not going to say, I'd probably say everything that I'd said in that video now, but I might say it with a little bit more grace, if that makes sense. Because she is very much a good, and a lot of people did come to me in the comments in that video and be like, oh no, she's a good source. She's supportive of the cause, etc., etc. And I was like, yeah, cool. I'm totally with that. And I'm thankful that I didn't say anything like really. I don't go around slandering people anyway, so that's not my style. But I was probably harsher now, knowing what she's like in retrospect, than I probably would be if I critiqued one of her videos now. But I think I've kind of like softened around the edges a bit anyway in general. So, but anyway, it is what it is. It was in the past. But she has a really good video, and she's done some amazing research. And one of the bits of research that she's done is kind of opened my eyes to the fact that this kind of Afrocentric struggle, for want of a better word, let's forget the fact that they've bastardized the word Afrocentric, and let's use it in its pure form, and Afrocentric being a worldview around when you're looking at, ancient history from the African perspective, okay? Like African history should be looked at. And one of the things that she highlighted, or at least has done some immense research on, is that struggle that we see, Diop is famous for, Obenga is famous for, John Henrik Clark is famous for, Joseph Ben Jochannan is famous for, Ivan van Sertima is famous for. That struggle that these guys took up and decided they were going to be the front of, it goes back. And when I say it goes back, I mean it goes back considerably. W.E.B. Dubois was born in 1868, and he was battling against racism in Egyptology from the late 19th century. So we're looking back at a lot of these scholars, at least from my perspective, and in my mind, they just kind of like had carte blanche to just spout their nonsense, kind of like what the geneticists and some of these anthropologists are doing now in terms of their, you know, completely illogical and biased perspectives, and the attempt to shoehorn ancient Egyptian in with the Eurasian, with the Levantine, without the anthropological basis. But they were facing now. In fact, sorry, we know that period of time, that late 19th century, mid 19th century, was a very racist time. But I always thought those people didn't have any resistance. But what Vanessa Davies has done, she's done some excellent research, and she's highlighted they always had resistance. There was always Black scholars that were out challenging this. And this was really cool to learn for me. I was like, really like, wow, you mean from the late in the 1890 whatever, we had Black scholars even back then, you know, writing to the head of curation at this university, writing to Egyptologists at that university, writing here, writing there, to get these things done. So that's really cool. So I'm going to be reading to you today from an article that she wrote. It's on her academia. So if you want to pick this up, by the way, I think I did post a link to it. There's a link in the description that links you to Vanessa Davies academia.edu. I'm going to be reading from a particular article that she's wrote, or that she's authored, and it's a really good article because it gives you insight into that time. So that's basically what we're going to be doing today. It's going to be read heavy. Okay. That's me being totally honest with you. I'm going to read it, and you're going to see basically how far back this, for want of a better word, struggle goes. And it goes back a lot further than perhaps, you know, than I was aware of. And I'll admit it, I'll put my hand up and say it was refreshing to learn that this, you know, there were, you know, people having to confront this kind of bias, and they were there. There were people on the side of, you know, Afrocentrism, quote unquote, available even back then. Okay, so I'm going to pull the article up and then we'll just get cracking. Okay. In the meantime, let me give a quick shout out to the people who are in the chat. James, how you doing? Joy, hope you're well. Smelly, Macy, G, Darth, Colombia, McFact, Censored / Egypt was black, Kieran / Surfactant, Felix. Welcome to you all. Thank you for coming. Ice T Right. I think I've read out most people's names there. Yeah, thank you everyone who's in the chat, and those of you who are available, obviously, who are watching and who aren't as vocal, you're very much welcome. And we'll be cracking soon. So she's one of the really brilliant things about Vanessa Davies as well, she makes all of her work available for free. By the way, follow me on academia.edu. All of the papers I've now got 2 papers on my account. I used to just have the one for about a good best part of a year. I've now got 2, and by tomorrow there'll be 3. So all of the articles I'll be posting, I'll be on my website. I'll also be posting on my academia.edu, and I'm going to try and just draft as many of these articles as possible, because, you know, why not? No. Okay, let me pull it up onto the screen. I haven't downloaded it, so I'm just going to read. Does it let you read the article from here? No, I've got to download it. Okay, I've got to open this in another account. Bear with me 1 second. Ba-bum. And those of you who are wondering, why don't I have any of this prepared? because I was out. Is the short answer. Okay, and we can get started now. I'm going to zoom in as well, just give you guys a good view of this. So if my reading is too slow, feel free to read ahead of me. Let's get cracking. All right, so I am no Egyptologist, that goes without saying. Dubois and the ancient Nile Valley, Vanessa Davies. By the way, the Nile Valley is what Vanessa Davies frequently refers to ancient Egypt and all of the civilizations down the Nile, such as, Kush. She refers to them as the North the North Nile Valley and the Southern Nile Valley, which I think is actually a cool reference. She looks at it as a kind of contiguous civilization because of the crossovers between Kush, I'm going to say quote unquote Nubia, because you guys know how I feel about Nubia having a separate demarcation, but Kush, Nubia, and Kemet, she looks at it as just one kind of like contiguous civilization split into north and south. So yeah, let's go from there. Many of W.E.B. Dubois' publications treat the ancient history of the Nile Valley, but his contributions may have been ignored within the discipline of Egyptology. Dubois continually addressed the Africanity of Nile Valley cultures. Beginning in the late 19th century, he tackled the categories of Negro and Negroid with relation to the ancient people of the Nile Valley and to modern humans. Although these categories are now recognized to be unscientific, at that time, the labels were used in the scientific discourse. The interesting thing is, there is that claim that, it's now unscientific, but we have the word term Negroid being used in papers as late as 2005, Anna Maria Makota's paper specifies Negroid characteristics in the skin of the ancient Egyptians. So it's still it's defunct, but when is the question, I guess. But I just thought I'd throw that up as a side note, because these terms do find themselves creeping back in. The replacement for Negroid now being sub-Saharan, which is geographically restricted and much worse. But let's carry on. Importantly, Dubois did not see the ancient Nile Valley cultures of Egypt and Sudan as Mediterranean, nor should the ancient Egyptian, Nubian, or Meroitic cultures be considered Mediterranean cultures. These Nile Valley cultures are African in their origins. There was, of course, contact between Nile Valley cultures and the cultures of the northern Mediterranean, Anatolia, the Levant, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and areas to the west and south in Africa. But to consider the ancient Nile Valley primarily in reference to the Mediterranean, Near Eastern, biblical worlds is to remove the region from its African context, an incorrect intellectual maneuver that overturns precisely the correction that Dubois and others made. Dubois operated in a predominantly white Western framework of academia. When he encountered incorrect theories about the origins of Nile Valley cultures, he did not step outside of the academic structures of his day. We see this in his choice of words. He used radicalized terminology, even when arguing against the validity of racial categories. Dubois drew on contemporary, I'm just keeping my eye on the comments. Cool. Dubois drew on contemporary Egyptological and anthropological sources, as well as ancient sources that argued for the Negroid presence in ancient Egypt and for the cultural and racial continuity of the people in the northern and southern Nile River Valley. And the amazing thing about this is you have to think about the time in which Dubois was doing this. This is pre-Diop. We don't know what kind of support network Dubois was falling back on, but he was going against an academic cabal in Egyptology when he was doing this. So, you know, a lot of respect. This is definitely has to be regarded as a trailblazer in that regard. Quick bit of research I'm going to do. It seems to me like this would predate the work of Carter G. Woodson as well. Let me just double check. Oh no, so that he's contemporaneous with Carter G. Woodson, who ironically also has given me really strong Ramesses vibes. What is all these old American scholars telling like Ramesses? That is crazy. Let me show you what Carter G. Woodson looks like. He looks like my wowzers. Have a look at this dude. Look at this one. That looks just like my old rendition of Ramesses. Looks like the statue that's in the British Museum. That's mad. That looks like my reconstruction, man. This is not, that looks like, he looks exactly like my reconstruction of Ramesses. This is freaky. Whoa. That is freaky. He looks just like my reconstruction of Ramesses. Especially here. That is really weird. Wasn't expecting that. Wowzers. Okay, anyway, let me carry on. Where was we? Pull that off screen. So yeah, it would have been contemporaneous with Carter G. Woodson, who, for those of you, most of you will know, but he's the one who wrote The Destruction of Black Civilization. So they're around the same time. So this is your Abenga / Diop version 1. You know, Diop and Abenga are kind of like the version 2 or maybe version 3 of these trailblazing duos. But anyway, where was I? Dubois drew on contemporary Egyptological and anthropological sources, as well as ancient sources that argued Negroid presence in ancient Egypt and for the cultural and racial continuity of the people in northern and southern Nile River Valley, as Egyptologists do today. So, as Egyptologists do today, Dubois allowed that the Nile Valley saw a mixing of population groups from the Mediterranean and other parts of Africa. Importantly, though, he countered the claims of Egyptologists who linked the ancient Egyptian culture with the Near East rather than Africa. And this is really key. It's impossible to restrict, you know, people from migrating into and becoming part of the population. But the question is, which culture is the one that's being adhered to? Which language is the one that's being spoken? Which practices are being upheld? And who are the native people regarded as? You know, that's the bigger question. And he seemingly stands quite strong on that. And he reinforced an African American claim to that heritage in his assertion that the ancient people certainly were not white in any modern sense of that word. Now, here's an important thing, because this is one of the things that people will try their best to raise that criticism. Go, oh, well, they're not related to West Africans, when they're trying to criticize Americans, or if you're some kind of, oh, well, they might have been black, but they weren't related to you. We've all heard these arguments ad nauseum. But you have to understand that that is a cope. That entire argument is a cope, because no one is trying to relate them directly to this group or that group. They are black. That's the argument being made. Could you find, relation between a group of Twa people, for instance, and, the 21st dynasty of ancient Egypt? I'd say maybe highly unlikely. They're black. That's the argument that was being made. It was, this is white, this is black. Whites created everything, blacks didn't create anything. It's like, no. We as blacks, we're too genetically diverse and too phenotypically diverse for anyone to try and make that argument about a relationship, because we can be unrelated to people that are in our nation who are stone's throw away from us. We can be further, have more genetic distance between each other because we're so genetically diverse than we do with other people in the world. An African man could be more closely related to a Chinese man than his neighbor. Africa is the only part of the world where you get this, but that's not the argument. That's not the question. That's not the discussion. The discussion is, Are or were they black? That is the argument. Okay. And by black, we mean the indigenous races of Africa. This chapter makes no claims as to the blackness or whiteness of the ancient people who lived in the Nile Valley for many reasons. Such terms have no scientific basis, their cultural meanings differ across population groups, and the ancient people who lived in the Nile Valley were a diverse people who exhibited a range of phenotypes, who were no doubt the holders of a range of genotypes, and whose historical time frame spanned 5,000 years or more, of which time we're going to see numbers of ethnicities passing in and out of the Nile Valley. Okay, it's impossible that we're going to have this continuous single ethnicity. And you have to approach ancient Egypt with the realization that you had probably a different ethnicity in every nome or every sapat. So having that understanding really does help you to understand the kind of diversity that you would have seen. Now, my argument is that all of that diversity will be native African diversity. All of that diversity will be native African diversity. It is a mistake to generalize as if those people were one unified and isolated population group. Instead, this chapter points out that Dubois and other scholars of African descent would strongly object to attempts to define the ancient Nile Valley solely or primarily in terms of the Mediterranean. Likewise, this chapter resists attempts to remove the ancient Nile Valley from its African context and resists attempts to consider the Nile Valley primarily in reference to the Mediterranean, Near Eastern, or biblical worlds. Isn't this serendipitous that we're actually coming across this article now, considering the kind of studies that we're getting that are trying to do just that, trying to make ancient Egypt a Mediterranean thing? Isn't it fantastic timing? Like earlier authors, Dubois linked the ancient cultures of the northern and southern Nile Valley. In March 1911, the cover of the 5th issue of The Crisis featured a line drawing and hieroglyphic label of the Nile Valley king, of a Nile Valley king. And it says here, one of the black kings of Upper Nile. So I think The Crisis is Dubois or something that Dubois was involved in editing. I could be wrong, but I'll double check. I'm sure it's going to be confirmed here. Although The Crisis described him as Egyptian, he is a Meroitic king. The slippage was one of cultural continuity. An article in that issue argued, and here's the interesting thing. He's a Meroitic king, and the article describes him as Egyptian. Now, a lot of people will say, oh, well, look, he's made an error there. Here's my argument. Before they flooded Nubia or Aswan or whatever you want to call it, the southern Nile Valley, and before they deluged the artifacts in that region, who's to say that Meroe wasn't considered as part of ancient Egypt? Was that a shifting point in the dynamics, in the understanding of what we classify as being ancient Egypt and not ancient Egypt? Because I wouldn't be surprised if the flooding of that region in order to create Lake Nasser and Lake Nubia, the flooding of that quote unquote Nubian region is what resulted in the muddying of the understanding of what was Egyptian and what wasn't Egyptian. I wouldn't be surprised at all. So she's kind of regarded it as an error. Oh, well, there's a Meroite king and he's been labeled as an ancient Egyptian. My thoughts is maybe he was regarded as an ancient Egyptian before, the huge changes were made by Egyptology. This is something that, I've pondered quite heavily about the moving of those borders, the prioritizing of these colonial borders that perhaps have no reference and have no reality in the ancient world. These are things that I definitely have pondered. The Egyptian label perhaps referred to the cover magazine image being stylized as Egyptian art, i.e. Egyptianizing. Completely unfounded is a contemporary art historian's accusation that the crisis altered the image to promote the Africanity of the ancient kings. The image was not changed in any way. True to Dubois' dedication to science, the drawing is an epigraphic drawing derived from the publication of the Prussian expedition, 1842 to 45. Interesting. There was no Germany back then, was there? So that's interesting. To Egypt and Sudan, and obtained by Dubois through an intermediary source. So we can see the original artwork here, photographed, versus the drawing. They are absolutely, in fact, I would say the artwork looks more African than the drawing. And yet people are complaining, saying, oh, he's Africanized it. And the ironic thing is, people who make those kind of claims about this being an Africanized version and he's made it look too African, I am convinced that those people have never seen genuine ancient Egyptian artwork, steles. Because if they saw steles, genuine steles that haven't been untampered from the old kingdom and haven't been had their faces chiseled off, they would find that everyone is depicted like that. Everyone is depicted like that. This is why those modern Egyptians and the modern antiquities are so busy chiseling, destroying, and defacing artwork to hide these features which are commonplace in ancient Egypt. Commonplace. It makes me want to pull up. I'm going to do just that. Sorry, a little side note. We will continue reading, but I feel like I just need to pull up a couple of steles from maybe one of my museum visits so we can remind ourselves exactly how the ancient Egyptians depicted themselves on steles, the ones that haven't been tampered. Let's look at I know I've got some good ones from the Noyes. Here we go. Okay, so I'm just going to pull this. I'm going to start here. I'm going to just literally scroll through these images if it doesn't crash. By the way, quick side note to everyone, I did shut down my PC and opened it up again. I think someone said there, have you tried switching it off, turning it off and switching it back on again? And I think the reboot, it's been the first reboot it's had for a couple of months. I think it did it well. So fingers crossed. That could be famous last words, but fingers crossed we get through half decent today without any untimely crashes. Oh, goodness me, close down. Sorry. My photos is taking ages to start up. Let's try again. I want to just open it. I don't want to edit it. Here we go. Open with. Hope Photos lets me scroll. Yes, it is going to let me scroll. Okay, so let me pull this onto the screen just so people know, because people look at those features and go, "Oh, well, those aren't Egyptian features." Well, let's have a look at these steles. Okay, untampered steles. Very normal Egyptian features, or Kemetic features, I should say. Let's scroll through. Okay, very normal Kemetic features. Very normal Kemetic features. Pronounced lips. Sometimes they're damaged, okay, like these ones. Okay, sometimes they're being sabotaged, but when they're not sabotaged, you will see that these steles possess the kind of features that are typical of what you've just seen in that one. Very typical. Let's zoom in nice and close there so everyone can see. Tampered, we can already see the layers have been stripped on that one, but have a look at the untampered ones. Untampered ones preserve the full Africanity, the full features. Full African features. Okay? You can even see the brown on some of them that haven't been ruined. So the ancient Egyptians had no problem showing their features in their steles, okay? When they're untampered and they haven't been completely wrecked and destroyed, you'll always see, or most of the time, see very typical African features. Look at these ones where they've been destroyed, face chiseled off. And people who will make the complaint, oh, well, it's iconoclasm. These people aren't kings being depicted here. There's normal people. What would possess someone? What would motivate someone to deface them in that manner, other than the fact that they were upset by the features they were being presented with? Look at those features. Look at this face. This face is virtually identical to this face, isn't it? Virtually identical. So people like to try and make this claim, you know, or the people who are making this claim about, oh, well, he's exaggerated the features, this, that, and the other, they clearly have got no reference. Clearly have got no reference to actual ancient Egyptian artwork, because they'll see that those features are dominant. Okay, those features are dominant in ancient Egyptian artwork. And by the way, this is not some preferential order. This is the snaps in the order that I took them when I was at the Neues Museum. So you can see that. So that's a good comparison. Let's carry on. The crisis began associating itself more closely with ancient Nile Valley cultures in November 1911, when the masthead featured an Egyptianizing image. Dubois' interest in ancient Egypt stemmed from his recognition that the ancient culture was one of power and authority. By drawing on royal and divine iconography such as the Nemes headdress, rearing cobra, and solar wings, the masthead communicated exactly that, the power and authority. Exactly that, power and authority. The close set drawn lines on the king's face signaled to readers that he was a member of the darker races that the magazine serves. The image communicated that the ancient people of Egypt and Nubia were of African descent, and that modern people of African descent have a lineage of power. So there it is. Look at this, is the logo he's talking about. It's pretty darn good. So he wasn't messing about. And once again, this is, it's something that you're perhaps maybe vaguely aware of, but this is very opaque, very open to the fact that there's clearly a debate going back centuries, you know, of people of Black/African ancestry, melanated ancestry, you know, making it clear that you're not going to just whitewash ancient Egypt. This is a battle we've been in for over 100 years. in the modern era, over 100 years. Dubois' engagement with Egyptology. So much of Dubois' work focused on the ancient cultures of the Nile Valley, yet he included the disclaimer that is the title of this paper in his 1939 preface to Black Folk Then and Now. But in the world and Africa, he described exactly whose work he consulted and which ideas he disagreed with, providing a laundry list of the biggest names of the field. He wrote about challenging authority Egyptologists of highest respectability who did not attack but studiously ignored the Negro. This is one of their tactics, okay? Perhaps they're not going to attack or engage you, but the one thing they will do is ignore the hell out of you and continue to spread their lies on the Nile and in the world, and talked as though Black folk were non-existent and unimportant. This could be read or written about today. In Black Folk Then and Now, Dubois explained the purpose of his engagement with Egyptology. Despite the popular and academic interest in the ancient history of the Nile Valley, and despite the archaeological publications of sites in Egypt and Sudan, almost nothing, he pointed out, is said of the Negro race. And obviously, once again, people will complain about this idea of conflating. Oh, well, it doesn't include you. It doesn't include you. But they know what the world was like back then. We all know what the world was like back then. No one was distinguishing between, no one was going, well, you're black and you're not because you're from Kenya and you're from Senegal. No one was going, oh, well, you're black and you're not because you're from Somalia and you're from South Africa. There was no confusion in regards to what constituted black. And the fact that even to this day, modern black people are falling for this trick of divide and conquer, dividing us now into these, obviously we want to appreciate the fact that we are genetically, ethnically, culturally, phenotypically diverse, but we also, I think it's very important to understand that we are part of a shared, we're part of a shared struggle here. Yeah, I have no problem reassigning all of ancient Egypt's history to, and you'll know I do this in my videos, I never make an attempt to try and draw it too far geographically from the groups that are currently surrounding the Nile, because I feel like they kind of embody everything that I need to communicate anyway. So I don't have any need to move it out of that. Are there arguments that there's relationship and there's cultural diffusion far beyond those borders? Absolutely there is. But to me, it's very simple. Black is black. African is African. Okay, we can worry about the other things later. Let's just first of all establish the fact that they're not going to take this civilization out of Africa. They're not going to take this culture out of Africa. That's really what is important in my view. But yeah, anyway, spoken enough. Let me carry on. Dubois knew that many writers cast the history of that region in a false light. Writers like British author Flora Shaw, Lady Lugard, and Harvard professor George Reisner tell us that the Nigerians and the Ethiopians were not Negroes. Yeah, they're doing this today, aren't they? Okay, even Nigerians back then. Now it's moved. Now it's like the Nigerians are definitely, apart from when they look at apart from North Nigeria. Now it's just it's just Yoruba. Okay, Igbo are kind of black. Northern Nigerians are not black at all. Yorubas, you guys are still black. Yoruba and Delta region, you guys are definitely black, but the rest of Nigeria is not black. But then look, Nigerians and Ethiopians were not black or were not Negroes. Isn't that amazing? The statement seems inexplicable until we learn that in their view, most of the black folk in Africa are not Negroes. The whole argument becomes merely a matter of words and definitions, exactly what they do now, semantic shifts, sub-Saharan. Oh, well, they're black, but they're not sub-Saharan. It's the same tricks, different century, exactly same tricks being used. Yet upon this easily misunderstood interpretation, millions of black and brown folk today, not to speak of most educated whites, have no conception of any role that black folk have to play in history, or any hope in the past for present aspiration, or any apparent justification in demanding equal rights and opportunities for Negroes as average human beings. And that is one of the key things that is at stake here, when people systematically strip and separate the people who history belongs to and claim everything. There is a very real consequence of that. And I think a lot of people don't understand that there's a real-time consequence for allowing your history to be co-opted by others. Dubois pointed out the conflation, which was common at that time, of all African people into one physical type, Negroes. So they conflate all of us into this physical type, and then they define Negro with a very narrow definition. And then anything that falls out of that is no longer black. It's a lazy and sloppy trick that they still use. We were discussing this when we were looking at the genetics papers the other day. And then the marking out of that physical type, see, exactly that, as the only true African person. Isn't that what I just said? Same tricks, different century. The conflation both delegitimized Africans in the diaspora as not really African and obscured all physical and cultural differences among African people. Dubois was not alone in recognizing the contradictory stances of Egyptologists and others who used a narrow definition of the racialized term Negro, Black. Switch that today to Sub-Saharan, and aren't we in exactly the same space? How much of this has moved on? Very little. To remove ancient Nile Valley history from its African context, decades before Dubois wrote those lines, other writers of African descent, such as George W. Williams, Pauline Hopkins, and Marcus Garvey, had argued against such claims. And she's got papers on these as well. So we're actually going to go back in time and go through these papers, because this argument, this kind of resistance, that's the word I was looking for, this resistance against this wall of lies that have just been for centuries in Europe, just compounding and compounding, there has always been resistance from our side. So much of what we value in Egyptology now, in terms of ancient Egypt now, is owed to Black scholars putting their stake in the ground and not allowing the history of the Nile Valley to be trampled on. We owe so much to them. But let me carry on. But Dubois' engagement with Egyptology is particularly interesting because of its length and complexity, particularly with regard to the Egyptologist Flinders Petrie. So this is really interesting. He was in discourse with Petrie himself, the Theum faker. Well, I'm going to go into that a bit later. Let's carry on. Dubois both relied on and in the case of the British archaeologist Flinders Petrie, even admired the scholars who generated some of the field's most widely discussed racist ideas. Like all persons of intellectual depth, the doctor experienced numerous conflicts within his complex identity. To the list of seemingly contradictory stances that he embodied, I would add another. Dubois operated within the constraints of a Western, predominantly white and male academic system, while advocating a view of Nile Valley history that was far outside of what the system promoted. I feel like I'm kindred spirit with Dubois. I do really, because he's kind of like, he's said from the start, he's not an Egyptologist, but sometimes it takes people who maybe are outside of the discipline to apply some common sense. So I really respect his stance and his position here. Let's carry on. Dubois was well aware of the racialization within Egyptology, and he contextualized it in relation to the era in which the university discipline arose. His explanation of the ancient Egyptian view of race dodged a strict black-white dichotomy to allow for some nuance. The ancient Egyptians certainly were not white in any sense of the modern use of that word. Okay, so think about the film that we saw yesterday and the claim that the actor made a really good Seti the First. Okay, that could be, well, that clearly is being argued against here. Neither in color nor physical measurement, in hair nor countenance, in language nor social customs. They stood in relationship nearest the Negro race in earliest times, and then gradually through infiltration of Mediterranean Semitic elements became what can be described in America as a light mulatto stock of octoroons and quadroons. Now, where I would offer my perspective on this is that I think a lot of the mixing came later, not just in, I totally understand this perspective, and I actually hold on to the fact that many people have and share this perspective. I share it, but only in the different, my only difference is that I condense it, and I believe most of that mixing that they're speaking of, this kind of Mediterranean mixing, took place after the New Kingdom. Okay, so from the late period onward is my perspective on when we really started to see a population shift. That's my perspective. But I respect his perspective here because it's one that would make logical sense. Putting aside his use of now discarded terms such as Negro race, octoroons, and quadroons, Dubois' statement accords with the views held by many contemporary Egyptologists. And that is true. Many Egyptologists do have this view. He knew that Egyptologists and historians tried to cut the history of the Nile Valley entirely away from the history of Africa and deny any connection between the two. He attributed the denial of history of African people to the economic demands, a desire in the West for specific goods, and the labor required to make those goods. All history, all science was changed to fit this new condition. Africa had no history. Wherever there was history in Africa or civilization, it was of white origin. And the fact that it was civilization proved that it was white. If black pharaohs sat on the throne of Egypt, they were not really black men, but dark white men. Ethiopia, land of the blacks, was described as a land of the whites. Crazy, isn't it? If at any time, anywhere, there was evidence in Africa of the human soul and the same striving of spirit and the same build of body found elsewhere in the world, it was all due to something non-African and not to the inherent genius of the Negro race. Isn't it funny? I just finding this, like, you would think in 100 years we would have moved on. Some might argue we've regressed. I think there's a strong argument to suggest that we've regressed somewhat. The racism manifested in such views was and is deeply embedded in the very structure of the academic system. The scholars whose views Dubois criticized were not even trained in other African cultures. And this is one of the key things, okay? Do you guys remember when I was, in my paper that I wrote regarding reassessing the reconstruction of Amenhotep III, when I was criticizing Cicero Marius, and one of my main criticisms was, you have no experience in African phenotype. And that wasn't presenting myself as an expert, by the way, but just trying to convey that the idea that you're going to go to Africa and reconstruct an African king and have no idea how African faces or African phenotype expresses itself differently across the continent of Africa, depending on location, have no idea what tropical adaptation looks like or highland adaptation looks like, have no idea how the different phenotypes in Africa express themselves, is ludicrous. But you can see that issue is one that's always been present. He says here, the scholars whose views Dubois criticized were not even trained in other African cultures. They have no idea or care about Africa. This is why they're unable to relate ancient Egypt to modern African cultures, because they don't even respect the surrounding African cultures enough to consider that they were related. You know, they don't even respect it enough to consider that they were related. Egyptologists frequently made connections with and worked sites in the Levant and Mesopotamia, largely driven by popular interest in and monetary support for uncovering information about biblical sites. But the vast majority of archaeologists working in Egypt were both uneducated about other African cultures and uninterested in working in other parts of Africa. The educational structure was set up and largely is still set up to not allow cross-cultural connections to be made between Nile Valley and elsewhere in the African continent. Isn't that crazy? So it's actually been structured in a way that crossing, the parapet, so to speak, between African studies or the study of Africa and Egypt. They've made it an impenetrable wall so that it becomes dangerous for a scholar to attempt to relate anything African with ancient Egypt. You have to cross it on the Eurasian front. You're fine to make relations between the Mediterranean and the Levant and ancient Egypt, but you're restricted from doing it with African nations. Isn't that interesting? I'm gonna have a quick look at it through the comments, and then we'll come back to this. Okay. B Campbell Soup says, I'm not angry enough. I'll leave that for you. If I get too angry, I can't read, my friend, you know. I don't know what that means. Pascal has left me a comment about make DNA to speak with responsibility. I mean, I don't know. They go straight to Arabia. They speak on the closest civilization. Yeah, exactly. You know, go straight to Arabia, skipping over African civilizations. That's literally what they do. The Hyksos changed the... Well, this is an interesting argument. I've heard this before. A lot of people make the argument that the Hyksos changed the demographic of ancient Egypt, and you kind of see a shift in the phenotype post Hyksos. Okay, so first of all, we don't know who the Hyksos are. I mean, there's still very big question marks about who the Hyksos are. We do have a couple of depictions of them, and to me, just based on depictions, they do look very closely related to kind of Cushitic peoples of Africa. There were people who are called the Cushitic peoples of Africa now, for want of a better word, although I don't think Cushitic is the best word, but the people who essentially inhabit the Somali regions of the Horn, some parts of kind of Central East Africa. They kind of share that phenotype from what I can see. But beyond that, we don't know a huge amount about who the Hyksos were. Also, we don't know if under the Hyksos occupation, we saw large migration of people. So did the actual population of Kemet change under the Hyksos? We obviously know we switched over to leadership, but how much rampant migration took place during this period of time? I've heard the claim that the 17th dynasty had or carried Hyksos blood, so would have carried that into the dynastic, you know, into the nobility, carried the Hyksos blood into the nobility. But I'll admit that I need to look into that further before I can substantiate that claim. But I've heard this before. We know that restoration, as it normally does, came from Upper Egypt, came from the south, to actually re-establish Kemet again as an independent state. But beyond that, don't have a huge amount to add to that. But it's a very interesting bit of insight there, because it's something I've heard before. So I don't think that. I think that actually modern Copts descend from Greeks. I think they're quite open about that. Or maybe that's a discussion to be had. But I think they descend from Greeks. I think modern Copts are openly very Greek. And the Greeks were very, 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 very mixed people, which would explain why you have so much diversity amongst the Copts. That and the Copts aren't as endogamous as people claim they are. So there's a few arguments there to be made, but yeah. All right, let's move on. Dubois and Petrie. The professional relationship between Flinders Petrie and Dubois began because of, let me just get rid of all the comments on the screen. Okay. The professional relationship between Flinders Petrie and Dubois began because of Petrie's expertise as an archaeologist in Egypt. Petrie's career in Egypt began in 1880. He was a prolific publisher of his fieldwork at sites up and down the Nile. In 1909, Dubois asked Petrie to join the board of advisors of his Encyclopedia Africana. 2 years later, they met in London when Dubois was attending the Universal Races Congress. That winter, while recuperating from emergency surgery in Egypt, Petrie read Dubois' The Soul of Black Folk and wrote to him in the US to share his thoughts on the themes Dubois raised in the book. This is interesting. Petrie's candid opinions expressed in his January 1912 letter to Dubois were laced with racism and ethnocentrism, overlaid by the contributing factors of colonial and class distinctions. Nothing less than what I'd expect from Flinders Petrie. He was a very ardent racist. They were building up there like it sounded like they had a good relationship. Isn't this interesting? In The Souls of Black Folk, Dubois argued for the importance of the American liberal arts style of education, a holistic course of study not intended to produce a worker of a particular type, neither a psychologist nor a brickmason, but to enhance how one lived life, to produce a human being. Petrie's letter could not have been more different in tone. He aroused the ire of Dubois with his explanation of the Englishman's objection to the native Egyptian person, his stereotyping of Egyptians as dishonest cheats, his privileging of Christian Egyptians over Muslim Egyptians, and his belief that education was unnecessary and even harmful to Egyptians. This is one of the, if not the preeminent voice in Egyptology. Listen to his disgusting views on humanity. This is the foundation of Egyptology, by the way. Just to be clear, this is the foundation of Egyptology. These are the people who were bringing artifacts out and apparently, would never tamper them or do anything dishonest. This is the guy who found, hundreds of intact Fayum mummies, just luckily, Fayum portraits. No skullduggery or fakery went on there. Let's carry on. Dubois' frustrated response prompted Petrie to try and mollify him with the feeble defense that he was only trying to illustrate that Europeans bore ill will towards all other races and were not just, as he put it, anti-Negro. Haven't we heard that before? It's not just you, Europeans have been like this to everyone. For Dubois, the issue of withholding education as a means of exerting control was a point that struck close to home. He wrote to Petrie that a similar argument was used by others to discourage his parents from educating him. The same injustice was done in reverse to Egyptologist Leo Hansberry. Petrie claimed that Egyptians did not need a classroom education because he could teach those who worked for him while they were in the field. Conversely, Hansberry, an African-American man, was allowed a classroom education, but his mentors at Harvard and Oxford did not permit him to work on excavations for fear of his influence on Nubian studies and on the Egyptian or Sudanese archaeological workers who might think they had agency to interpret their own history. Wow. If that does not absolutely send you, there's nothing else that is shocking. Can I just read that again? Petrie claimed that Egyptians, I'm going to read from here because this is just really something. Petrie claimed that Egyptians did not need a classroom education because he could teach those who worked for him while they were in the field. Conversely, Hansberry, an African-American man, was allowed a classroom education, but his mentors at Harvard and Oxford did not. Harvard and Oxford, by the way, so we're going across the Atlantic here, the two top universities, did not permit him to work on excavations for fear of his influence on Nubian studies and on the Egyptian or Sudanese archaeological workers who might think they had agency to interpret their own history. In both situations, constraints on education were made to ensure that white European and American scholars controlled the historical narrative of the Nile Valley. And you're going to tell me that that didn't come with the building of fakes, iconoclasm, the destruction of artworks. If they're willing to do that, they're willing to say this black man cannot be seen. We cannot allow the Egyptians, who obviously in this time, we're talking early 20th, late 19th century, were still predominantly black, by the way. This is what I mean about the recent demographic, the more recent demographic shift that people probably aren't picking up on. We can't allow them to see an educated black man because they'll start thinking they have a right to their own history. Oh my gosh. Sorry. Let's carry on. Dubois clearly disagreed with Petrie on a number of issues. Not only the topics discussed in their exchange of letters in early 1912, but in a larger philosophical sense. With Petrie's permission, Dubois published their correspondence in The Crisis. The title left no doubt in the mind of the reader as to the tone of the letters. Despite this obvious difference of opinion, Dubois' administration of Petrie was undimmed. In 1956, when reflecting on his earlier attempt to create the Encyclopedia Africana, he recounted that among the advisors he had signed on the greatest of Egyptologists, Flinders Petrie. Wowzers. Let me give a shout out to Will. Thank you very much for your $2 donation. And we are an hour in. It's 10 past 10. And I'm really sorry, guys, but we're going to wrap up the stream there. But don't worry, part 2 will be tomorrow. I know you guys are going to hate me for this, because you're probably, if you're like me, probably kind of at the edge of your seats wanting to hear how this story is going to conclude. Will, thank you very much. You've upped your donation to $20. Shout out to you. Much appreciation. I'm going to continue this tomorrow, guys. Please join me. We'll do the same time. Okay, we'll do 9 p.m. tomorrow, and we're exactly halfway through, so we should get right to the bottom of this paper by tomorrow. If you can't wait till then, I have put a link in the description. If you want to read it without my narration, you are very, very welcome to. Will, I'm going to put your comment on the screen because you didn't leave one. So he says, thank you, man. Love your content. Well, thank you for showing your support. I'm glad you love it. Thank Vanessa Davies as well. She's a fantastic scholar. I'm going to try and get her on the channel. I want to interview her on Down with the King. She's very brilliant. And I kind of feel like I need to explain that video where I came for her a little bit, because we owe her for stuff like this. This is excellent scholarship. And for her to actually go and do the hard work of digging out all of these amazing, from the archives, these amazing interactions that Black educators were having with Egyptologists from as early as the 19th century is really something. It's a phenomenal bit of research she's done there. But yes, thank you, guys. Thank you very, 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 very much for joining me. Let's carry this on tomorrow. I'm glad you found it fun, those of you who are enjoying this article, to see what we've been putting up with for 100 years. And let's continue this train tomorrow. Let me give a shout out to all of you who are here. Everyone's changing their names. She who must be obeyed. Your name was something different yesterday. I'm trying to remember what your name normally is. DTA, RJ McKenzie, Nerd Large, CTB, Campbell's Soup, Pasquaz, Jobless Forever, Petrina, and the rest of the crowd, Michael Hunter, everyone who I shouted out, I think earlier, Darth Skywalker, Kia, Nerd Large. Thank you all for joining me, guys. I'm very much appreciate it. And a big shout out to Kieran and Will for your donations today. I'm glad you're enjoying this. Let's continue this story tomorrow. Have a great evening. Make sure you hit the likes before you go so as many people can view this as possible. And yeah, we'll carry on tomorrow. Yeah, YouTube's done something weird, hasn't they? They've gotten rid of screen names. So I must be appearing as King Mono. So yeah, interesting. Anyway, have a good one, guys. See you soon.